classic yellow jacketed copy, and my shock endures, not so much as the book, although the book is still shocking, but that my mom gave it to me to read when really it should have been tucked away on some high shelf behind The Catcher in the Rye. So that was sort of it. That was the gateway for me. And then I gradually began researching Philip Roth, which is something I've been doing for the last 10 years or so. So that's the sort of standing on one foot answer to that question. So anyway, what I figured we might do now is I would read for a bit, talk about Roth, and then pause briefly, and then we'll take a little trip into the Roth archives to see what Roth had to say about his father in the privacy of his letters. And then pause, stop, and you can ask me some questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. And then maybe about midnight or so, we'll break and I'll get bagels and lox or something. Anyway, so we'll begin the first part of that now. Today's gospel is Patrimony. I confess I'm not a scholar, and so I'm presenting more of a fan's notes. As I told Nadine, I really admire this book. To my mind, it's one of Roth's great performances, maybe one of the great American memoirs, and I'm not alone. Often I'll loan out hardcovers, but as I've learned, you can't loan Patrimony. It never comes back. You might as well make it a gift. That's how people regard it. What makes Patrimony worth reading and keeping? To be sure, it's unusual, an outlier in the Roth canon. Roth wrote 31 books, mostly novels, rarely dabbling in memoir. This isn't rude Roth, crude Roth, or any of the other familiar Roths we might expect. Perhaps that explains why everyone, critics and readers alike, delighted over it. These were rare events, the solar eclipses in Roth's career, when no one called him a sexist, a narcissist, or a self-hating Jew. It happened with The Ghost Rider, a masterpiece, and The Plot Against America, a bestseller. Like those works, Patrimony is tame, somewhat well-behaved, domesticated. Or is it? Is Patrimony what it seems? A pious book by an impious writer? It's certainly a serious book about family, separation, and most of all, survival. What goes into survival isn't always pretty, Roth writes, a lesson, a credo, sort of a talisman. Everybody's battle is different, he writes, and the battle never ends. 9 words, a pretty good summation of Roth's worldview. If that perspective rings true, some aspects of Patrimony do feel familiar. Roth loves an absurd premise, grounded in simple, mundane details. So begins Patrimony. Herman Roth, the patriarch, is suddenly stricken. One normal morning, he peers into a mirror and, like Gregor Samsa, finds himself transformed. Half his face was no longer his, Roth tells us, describing Herman's sagging, paralyzed cheek. This surreal event, Kafka meets Oliver Sacks, is squarely in the Roth tradition. One day you're healthy, the next you're grotesquely transformed. From this ominous opening, we follow the course of Herman's illness, his grim journey from health to helplessness, a path paved with indignities. Herman, who we'll come to know so intimately we feel related to him, turns out to be a contradictory man, caring but coarse, charming but rude, a world-class nudge. He's the type of man who, after being mugged, yells, "Now don't go out and spend it on crap." He's relentless. He wears people down. His response when faced with someone foolish enough to resist his advice is to hock him and hock him and hock him until he comes to his senses. That's Roth. In short, a deeply lovable, utterly maddening character who, though often wrong, insists on his rightness. And his famous son, Philip? A good Jewish boy here, loyal, patient, and protective. We can measure his devotion to his father by his inability to tell him the truth about his diagnosis. Not once, but twice, we see him caught between impulses, honesty on one hand, protectiveness on the other. Naturally, the father-son relationship is the central saga, though we sense that the real drama happened decades ago in 1940s Newark. Today, they're mostly chums. So it's slightly surprising that Patrimony is quite so interesting. In a way, Roth is writing with one hand behind his back. His trademarks, gleeful tirades, grand eruptions of humor and candor, are absent here. Roth's characters are always wandering into traps, then through guile and zeal rescuing themselves. That doesn't happen either. There's no hysteria, the book's temperature never spikes, the fun machine is temporarily decommissioned. Roth, genetically wired to offend, obeys decorum, And did I mention there's no sex? So what makes Patrimony riveting? The drama, such as it is, comes from Herman's impossible choice. He can have surgery, a dreadful ordeal, or live with the large tumor causing his paralysis. Both options might cause debility, dependence, in short, the loss of everything that defines him. Meanwhile, we have the familiar reversal of roles in which the child becomes the parent. Roth begins his mission to protect the father, plan his treatment, and reconcile himself to his inevitable yet unthinkable demise. Roth cares for his feeble father without forgetting their former battles. Sympathy pulls in one direction, memory in another. What really keeps us rapt, however, is Roth's voice, his enlivening company. And Roth has never been more present. In his fiction, Roth always made himself vulnerable, but with masks, alter egos known as Zuckerman, Kepes, and Portnoy. These masks were essential to his art, the essence of his art. Here, though, he speaks directly, undisguised, in the first person. Roth, the master trickster, is without his tricks. The result is a breakthrough, an honest, undefended book, Roth's first and only, I think. The novelty may be more interesting than his confessions, which are what you might expect of a person in his situation. Overwhelmed, he cries. At times, he regresses. He feels unmanned, to use an old-fashioned term that seems apt. In another writer, this might seem rote, mere exhibitionism, but for Roth, these are rare and startling admissions. One senses they're made against great inner resistance, and so they matter more to us. Then there's the prose, as clear and tough as ever, yet fully adaptable. Late in the book, Roth finds his father asleep, still breathing, still living, still with me. That sentence, its very syntax and repetition, expresses a longing for Herman's continued existence. The pathos is in the lyricism, the soft consonants, breathing with me. Roth, always concerned with bodies, describes his father wonderfully. Herman is neither handsome nor ugly, but perfectly average in a practical way. He had settled upon looks people trusted, rather than envied or praised. Besides the pleasure of writing well, what inspired this book? Not his usual muse, anger, or indignation, or self-assertion. Why did Roth record these awful, painful events? Patrimony may be a tribute, an elegy, but mainly it's an act of preservation. Remember everything, Roth tells himself, so that when he is gone, I can recreate the father who created me. Curiously, this injunction to remember is something that connects Roth with, of all things, religious Judaism. Roth wasn't frum, didn't worship, wouldn't have recognized the inside of a shul, but the command to remember, zachor, is central to Judaism. In Patrimony, memory is exalted, it's almost sacred. Indeed, Patrimony may be Roth's religious book, in the sense of being reverent. Roth, poet of plain speech, sounds more like Updike's, whose aim, he once said, was to give the mundane its beautiful due. Indeed, Roth doesn't always sound like Roth in this memoir. The past decade seems to have imbued him with a new wisdom. You spend your whole life preparing for a parent's death, then it happens and you're totally unprepared. What's lost isn't only your parent, it's your identity as a son. Then the parent's memory fades with painful speed and grief subsides, further weakening the bond. Much in Patrimony suggests that Roth knows all this. Thus, he clings to memories, fragments shored against his ruin. What else is lost in this memoir of losses? One's confidence, one's bearings. This is a familiar predicament from both life and art. Jung called it a midlife crisis. Dante wrote, in the middle of the journey of our life, I came to myself in a dark wood where the direct way was lost. That's where Roth is now, drifting, confused. And you may find yourself in another part of the world, goes the Talking Heads song, and you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here? Like Dante and the Talking Heads, Roth is utterly lost. I don't understand anything, he repeats, finding relief in this mantra. Thus, one of Roth's great themes, confusion, incomprehension, is introduced here. It's just a stone's throw from another great Roth theme, being wrong. It's how we know we're alive, he famously wrote, we're wrong. The lesson resounds through Roth's later works, where wrongness reigns. In Patrimony, wrongness is less a state of being than a source of dread. Roth's great fear as he ponders his father's risky surgery is that they'll make the wrong decision. Nothing in his past has equipped him to deal with this situation, yet he has no choice. We're in Samuel Beckett territory. He must deal with it. He can't deal with it. He'll deal with it. There aren't many jokes in Patrimony, but Roth being Roth, there is deadpan, even slapstick. Herman can't pronounce bulbayes. Apparently, I can't pronounce it either. So he calls it balabusta. as in, pass the balabusta, more balabusta, please. Herman scolds his girlfriend for buying a bad cantaloupe until Philip can't take it anymore. Look, a cantaloupe is a hard thing to buy, he says, raving that I'd rather buy a car than a cantaloupe. I'd rather buy a house. I'll tell you about making a mistake with a cantaloupe, he goes on. We all do it. We weren't made to buy cantaloupe. This is shtick, but sincere shtick. Roth preaching patience to his stubborn, impatient father. True, sometimes a cantaloupe is just a cantaloupe, but here it's a metaphor. Only Roth could get away with this. Because this is Roth, we wander into the realm of the unsayable, as all Roth's books must eventually. What Roth admits to really is being the kind of person his father scorns, a fragile, sensitive person, even a weakling. No doubt Herman would tell him to toughen up. The second, more painful admission is that he sometimes wanted a different father, a gentler, more accepting father, a more polished, better educated father. In the end, he betrays this father by exposing his frailty and simpleness, a simpleness one suspects the son secretly envies. Herman, however crude, has no pretensions, is always simply himself. Contrast that with the son, who speaks upper-class Gentile English and seems always in search of himself. Herman never wonders who he is. What is the patrimony in Patrimony? That is, what is being handed down? The Roths share a religion, hard work, as well as seriousness, stubbornness, bluntness, excessiveness, and perhaps humor. The jokes originate with him, Roth says. And of course, tenacity. This book, Patrimony, is tightly wound around the theme of survival. In a sense, Roth wrote to survive. That may be true of many writers, but Roth especially. There were things inside him, angers, confusions that he needed to get out of him, including a seething talent. Talent, if bottled up, turns corrosive, devouring the creative person. But Roth managed to channel all of his talent and ambition into his writing. Another title for Patrimony might be The Art of Survival. Of course, survival isn't an option for 86-year-old Herman. Patrimony is ultimately a book about letting go, the impossibility of letting go, the necessity of letting go. For Roth's characters, it is impossible, as it was for Roth, who, for all his rage and disappointment, was deeply attached to the world. This is someone, after all, who walked and swam daily, avoided most foods, and endured multiple heart surgeries in order to prolong his life, however much life disappointed him. This was also true of Mickey Sabbath, whose hate for the world is so great it spills over into a kind of love. He just couldn't die, we learn at the end. Everything he hated was here. Naturally, this fondness for life produced a kind of sentimentality. It isn't new. What Roth called the tenderness had been building for years. It's there in the anatomy lesson, and it explodes in the 2000s. The tenderness was out of control, Roth wrote in Every Man, and it was directed everywhere: his family, his country, his friends, his childhood. Patrimony, for its part, feels like a dam built against emotion, but it's a dam that could easily burst, drowning the writer and reader in emotion. While looking backward to Roth's parents and uncles, Patrimony heralds Roth's future novels. We are immoderate because grief is immoderate. That's not Patrimony, that's Sabbath's theater. Old age isn't the battle, old age is a massacre. That's Every Man. Nobody knows anything. That's the human stain. He had learned the worst lesson that life can teach, that it makes no sense, American Pastoral. All these books came after Patrimony, but they have their roots in Patrimony. The memoir even mentions the frighteningly unforeseen, the great theme of Roth's American trilogy. Are we ever free? That is, free of our origins, our obligations, our formative and deforming experiences. Roth might say yes, but his books often say no. As Patrimony concludes, Roth has a dream, a nightmare really, in which Herman haunts his guilt-ridden son. So much of Roth's writing is about freedom, the need for freedom, but here he's plainly trapped. You've done the wrong thing, Herman says, a damning sentence. It implicates the son, but also the harsh, judgmental father. On this ominous note, we conclude. Family is love, family is protection, but it's also the nightmare from which you never awaken. Family is home, a home you escape from, but inevitably wind up returning to, if not in life, then in writing. Like that dream, Patrimony is ambiguous. Is it an elegy, a Kaddish, a reckoning? The answer is yes. The book's keynote is confusion. Will the father survive? Can the son survive without the father? This might be an apt note to end on, except for one thing. Out of confusion comes wisdom about family, about oneself, about freedom and its limits. No, one story isn't a skin to be shed. It's inescapable, Roth writes in The Prague Orgy. This notion that family is destiny, that one's inheritance can't be shed, is the lesson of Patrimony. Dying is work, and he was a worker, Roth writes. As Roth himself was dying, he would say to friends, I have work to do. So that's the end of my little spiel. And now maybe let's take a peek behind the curtain and explore the archives. It turns out Roth was relieved when Patrimony was finished. And one interesting fact is that he finished it in January 1989, while Herman was still alive, then added a coda 9 months later after Herman died. Roth wasn't, strictly speaking, remembering these events. He was recording them as they happened. Indeed, Roth would describe the book as a collaboration between the men. Philip taking notes, Herman, in effect, writing the chapters. Roth was hardly optimistic about the book's reception. I myself don't predict a big life for this book. It tells people what they least want to know, he told a friend. After publication, Roth hid away, ignoring the phone, avoiding reviews. Publication turns me into a cocker spaniel, too easily pleased and too easily hurt. Did he really disconnect his phone with Roth? You never really know. But he needn't have worried. The critical response was positive, even gushing, and friends agreed. Patrimony is a sensationally good book, perhaps the most perfectly wrought of all your works, Janet Malcolm told him. So what was home life really like for the Roths of Newark? Never again to feel such tender devotion and a desire to escape, Roth wrote in a draft of the anatomy lesson, a line he later deleted. But life was evidently quite difficult. I have just had as much as I can bear, Roth told a friend. This was in 1959. Home life was often intense and conflict-ridden. Oh, the kinds of destruction loved ones can pour upon each other, he wrote that friend in 1959 while visiting home. I don't think anybody in the world but the goddamn Jews can kill each other so. That changed gradually. By his 30s, a decade after he had fled the family home, Roth had forgiven his father, mostly. And by Roth's 50s, he had come to think differently about his Newark childhood. I came away thinking that I had the most privileged childhood imaginable. I don't think this is nostalgia speaking. That's him in 1990. As Patrimony makes clear, Herman always took up an enormous amount of space in his son's life. It was like having a continent disappear, Randall Jarrell said after Freud's death, and so it was for Philip Roth. It's been a year since my father died, and his absence is enormous now, Roth told a friend in October 1990. Okay, and with that, I'll finish up here and hopefully take some of your questions.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I also wanted to mention that The Guardian had an article this week, and it mentioned the top 10 books about fathers and sons. So I'll put that link in the chat if any of you haven't seen that.
Did Patrimony make the cut?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So I think we've got one question in the Q&A. Please feel free to type questions into the chat. You can also raise your hand and I will unmute you. So there's a more general question in the chat. This is from Kate. I asked this of all Roth scholars, why no Nobel Prize to Philip Roth?
Whew. Well, Roth had a theory about this. And his theory was that Claire Bloom's vindictive memoir, A Doll's Life, Leaving a Doll's House, doomed his chances for that. Probably untrue. I mean, I think Roth is certainly deserving of the Nobel. If you look at the list of Nobel recipients, Harold Pinter, for example, Roth is probably more deserving than a great number of them. Who knows the whims of the Nobel committee? It could be that Roth was writing about subjects that sort of fell out of favor for the Nobel Committee. There was also a sort of prejudice at some point against American writers for their perceived provincialism. So we can't really peek into the minds of the Nobel Committee, but it could have been any number of factors.
Roth had such a strong vibe of fairness about him, inclusive of people's views and their makeup when you're not expecting it, like Fiona and the Human Stain. Did Roth get that from his father? Wasn't his father a fair person?
That's a good question. I think the father certainly, the father is a complex and contradictory character because on one hand, he's an immensely stubborn, coarse, difficult, abrasive character who could certainly rub people the wrong way. On the other hand, I don't detect any bias in him. He spent his career, or at least a large chunk of it, working with and among Newark's African-American population. So I think he was open to pretty much everybody and probably had a very firm sense of fairness. What was the criteria on which he judged people? It probably had nothing to do with race or gender. It had to do with parts of their character and whether or not they had a certain kind of integrity and honesty. So in that sense, I think that question is definitely onto something.
And both he and his father seem to have many of the same beliefs and values, but I think maybe they just lived them out differently because of their generational differences.
Yeah, I think that question kind of answers itself. One of the interesting, they were profoundly alike and profoundly different. And one of the interesting differences is education, refinement, cultivation. One of the ironies of these two Jewish generations is that the older generation slaves away at a difficult job in order to fund the education of the younger generation. And that enables the younger generation to separate and in some ways to judge the older generation. And there's some of that in Patrimony. Roth goes off to college and he sees himself peculiarly as a sort of proxy for his father, getting the education that his father couldn't acquire. So in some ways that results in an estrangement between the generations, yet it's the gift that the older generation provides the younger generation.
Are there other authors who showed their love for a father in the same way that Roth does in Patrimony? Someone said that it was unusual before Roth's time for authors to write about their fathers in such a way, but it's become more common in recent decades.
Oh God, you're asking me about other authors. Roth takes up 95% of the literary space in my head. Given some time, we could probably think of some other father-son memoirs. Who else has written about, books about mothers come to mind. There are some wonderful books about the tormented relationship between mothers and daughters. I'm thinking of Vivian Gornick's Fierce Attachments, which is a kind of, pendant or companion to Patrimony in my head. But I would have to think some more about whether there are other great son-father memoirs. Martin Amis writes about Kingsley Amis in his memoir Experience. But just off the cuff, I can't think of any others, which probably means there are many I'm not thinking of.
I'll just mention the ones that were written, talked about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just very quickly, Featherhood by Charlie Gilmore, Just
Okay.
Ignore Him by Alan Davies, Fathers by Sam Miller, My Father's Fortune by Michael Frayn, A Clip of Steel by Thomas Blackburn, Letter to His Father by Franz Kafka,
Okay.
The Return by Hisham Matar, My Father and Myself by J.A. Ackerley, and Father and Son by Edmund Goss. And Patrimony was number one on the list.
I'm glad those are books I haven't heard of, because otherwise it would mean I'm forgetting things. A clear reference point is Kafka's letter to his father. Incidentally, they were both very powerful, domineering, kind of ferocious fathers named Herman.
Let's see. Ira has a question. So let's see.
Anything, Ira, except for like about the last half of When She Was Good.
Ira posted the question in the Q&A, but Ira, I'm going to unmute you. So please do ask the question now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Uh-huh.
can.
Hello. Wonderful. Terrific presentation. I think you need to do it again because we have to unpack it. There's so many great ideas in it. But the question is simple. How do you think creating Herman in Patrimony, and he is a literary figure in addition to the reality, how do you think it affected the way Roth represented other fathers in his fiction post Patrimony? Taking Swede as a perfect example. So essentially, what's Herman's influence, not just on Roth, but on Roth's later fiction?
Oof, that is not a simple question, Ira, and you know it. There are
I do.
different fathers. There are different kinds of fathers in Roth's fiction. I mean, if we can generalize, they tend to be somewhat Herman-like. They tend to be nudges, somewhat controlling, overbearing figures. But, the rule in Roth is that there is no rule. You can't really generalize. So Herman Roth will reappear in the Plot Against America. And he's basically himself there in somewhat milder form. The father, Swede Lvov, is completely different. He is a gentle and patient and accepting man who happens to be horribly buffeted by life. Then again, in the Ghostwriter, we have another kind of father, a literary father in Lanov. So fathers are various. As always, Roth is really hard to generalize about.
If I am permitted a follow-up, tell us about mothers and why Roth's book doesn't even have room in Patrimony to really include his mother in any way, whether of the past or of the moment. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we would have to disinter Philip Roth and ask him, and I'm sure he would refuse to answer. I think there is some really sensitive stuff there involving the somewhat inscrutable Bess Roth. She is a dark continent. We don't know a whole lot about her. Roth spent his adult life refuting the canard that Bess Roth was the mother in Portnoy's complaint. Just going by what we know about the actual Bess Roth, there were some similarities between her and that character, but surely there's a whole lot more to be written about her. From what we do know, she was I was going to say volatile, but sort of an unreliable parent. Both loving and at times also crushing. There's a famous story about how, to punish the young Philip Roth, she would lock him outside of the family home until he had learned his lesson, and only then allow him to re-enter. So she could be that kind of parent. She could also be a very tender and loving and proud parent.
So if he had written more about mothers, his chances of a Nobel Prize might have increased.
Maybe he could have ingratiated himself. Who knows? Maybe there's some buried manuscript and it'll be unearthed one day. I doubt it, but you can never rule anything out with Roth.
Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Nadine.
Thank you, Ira. Our next question comes from Roger. That's in the chat. Roger, I'll unmute you if you would like to ask your question. Please go ahead.
I actually, through my mother, knew a little bit about Roth, and she found him, having had dinner with him, a very crusty kind of curmudgeon-y type. And so I have this mental image of Roth as maybe in his later years as kind of tough that way. And So when I read the book, I was overwhelmed with just the purity of the love that he was expressing towards his father, almost unquestioning, and to the point where he took his own toothbrush to
Mhm.
clean up the excrement and the cracks of, and was proud of it. I mean, I was genuinely struck by that. I wonder if you felt the same way.
Well, I think you just confirmed something that I've always kind of believed, which is that the way to meet a writer, any writer, including Roth, is through his work. Because when you meet them in person, you're really getting just the scarcest scrap of him. Roth exists in his work, where you get that incredible, capacious, busy world inside his head. And that to me is Philip Roth, more than the person who appears in public, who could be, as you describe him. I only met Roth once, and it was a brief, awkward encounter a couple of blocks from Zabar's. And it was definitely not the Roth that I've encountered through his work and through this work in particular. As to what you said about the love and the tenderness in this book, it's clearly there, and yet the book is also informed by, I think, Roth's memories of a very difficult, abrasive, controlling father. It's hard to avoid the fact that this is on some level a betrayal of the father. The father, a private person, defined by his strength, is here shown to be weak and enfeeble and sort of abject. I mean, that is a horrible scene, the scene that you mentioned. And at the end of it, the father extracts a promise from the son. And the promise is that the son will never tell anyone about what's just happened. And here the son is telling everybody. So, take that for what it's worth.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, we're going in order. So next was going to be Amy. Oh, Amy, go ahead.
Softballs, Amy.
Hi. So once again, my neighborhood did not know that this was Philip Roth Book Club Day. So there are leaf mulchers and leaf blowers. But I don't know if I have a question so much as a comment and then maybe a conclusion. Firstly, what I said in my comment was thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I learned so much. And while you were speaking, I was thinking about my time at the Newark Public Library, sitting next to Nadine, reading a Paris Review interview that Hermione Lee did with Roth, probably while he was writing Patrimony, although she didn't know it. So she came equipped with questions about Roth's treatment of women, and he was so impatient. And in passing, she says, I noticed that there's a copy of Erik Erikson's book on his nightstand. I forgot the title of the book, but it's Erikson's work on fathers and sons. It's the psychoanalytic study about how sons relate to their fathers. And I just, to this day, I think if only Lee had the presence of mind to ask Roth about fathers and sons. And is that, could you imagine how differently that interview would have gone? And then, but now as I'm talking, I'm thinking maybe that's true for all of us who have tried to interview Roth. Are we asking the wrong questions, or we don't know enough yet about what's in his head or what was in his head as he was writing his books?
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of this book, and maybe of all books, is that it's very tough to hide yourself. Even your attempts to hide are revealing. What you keep secret is very revealing. So I have a hunch that most of what Roth thinks about Herman is there in this book, either explicitly or between the lines. The Paris Review interviews are kind of tricky because they're sort of they're collaborations between the interviewer and the writer. So that interview in particular, I think, is very carefully stage managed. I'm not sure even the great Hermione Lee could have extracted anything from Philip Roth that he didn't really want to to reveal in that context. But yeah, it would have been fascinating to read Hermione Lee's biography of Roth. At one point, she was one of the contenders for that role. You know, many unwritten books in the Roth oeuvre, including the book about his mother that he never wrote, and many unwritten biographies.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, Guy is next. Go ahead, Guy.
As I wrote there in the question and answer thing, I thought that scene, and I haven't reread it just recently, where the father loses control of his bowels and Roth has to clean him up. I thought that was a big deal in the book. I thought that was a big dramatic point. And my recollection is that the narrator even says something about that's relevant to the legacy. And I wonder what that meant, because what that seems to mean is that the father's leaving to Roth both the idea that it comes to shit, and also that helplessness is the final message that he's got to you, but not just the negative part of it, but also helplessness. And in the world, you might be lucky enough to have a son who does something for you, but that's how you're going to end up. I mean, didn't you think that was a big deal? The way you were talking about it just now made me think that you thought it was just kind of a peripheral bit, you know?
Oh, it is certainly not peripheral, and I'm glad you're the first person to curse here, because it opens the door for me. Yeah, what the father says in that is, oh, excuse me, what Roth says is that this was the father's legacy. You know, not any number of things, but the shit. And I'll admit, I really don't know what to make of that, because the rest of the book contradicts it. The rest of the book lists all of these inheritances, things that Philip gets from his father. They may not be the material possessions that he wanted. At one point, he says that he really wished his father had given him his tefillin. And not because they would be involved with any religious ritual, but because the object is invested with such great meaning and the gesture would have been meaningful. So when Roth says that, this is what he's received from his father's excrement. I'm baffled by that. I really don't know what Roth meant, because his father has given him so much more. But without question, that is a pivotal scene in the book. It's the one that everybody seems to remember because it's shocking.
Well, isn't that the deep thing in Roth, that he can't help but expose that? It's like you said about Beckett, you know, we can't go on, but we go on. And that's what Roth did. He started writing, then he kept writing. And, but his insight, which I thought was key, is that there's what it comes to.
You know, Roth says at some point in this book that his father's credo is survivorship. He kind of conjugates the word several different ways just in order to emphasize it. And Roth was a great survivor. In a way that was central to Roth's life. A friend of his says that, you know, the essential thing for Roth is survival. So perhaps, you know, that's his patrimony as well.
Thanks. I think you've had a down-to-earth kind of presentation. Didn't chase away us who are not academics.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, Anita had a comment. Let's see, Anita, I can unmute you and you can just mention it, please. Anita? Okay, so let's see. Anita said, Bob Mason wrote about Gentle Giant, about his father, the Swede, Wequaig's athletic hero. So that was her comment. second. And Arlene. And then we had a comment from Arlene. Go ahead, Arlene.
Arlene, thank you. I just mentioned the mother in The Plot Against America. There he writes as himself as a little boy, and the mother is shown to be really compassionate and competent. Do you think that reflects the real mother? That's what I always thought.
Would that it were so. I think it reflects a side of the mother. You know, everyone in Roth world, including Roth, and I think this is always the thing to remember, is they're complex, they're multifaceted. You know, writing about Roth is hard. And one of the reasons is that he's really different people. You know, the Roth you meet in person is different from the Roth you meet on the page. And the Roth you meet in one context in real life is different from the Roth you would meet in another context. You know, there are patterns to his life, there are patterns to his relationships, there are patterns to each individual relationship. And this is what makes Roth extremely difficult to write about, and also impossible not to write about, because he's so fascinating and complex. And it's something for you know, biographers have to keep this in mind, is that you're not writing about simple people. You know, Roth's father, although simple in some ways, is also really complex in other ways. And that was surely true of Roth's mother as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question.
We have about time for one or two more questions. Roger had a follow-up, so let's see, go ahead. Let's see, Roger, oh, go ahead.
You said you found the shit scene to be somewhat inexplicable, but I took it as the shit is a gift, more valuable than the shaving mug or villain or anything else, because it provided an opportunity for this kind of purity of the love that he was able to give to his father, and reverse that role of fathers and sons. I took it as a very, very metaphorical, important statement that that by losing his bowels, his father had given the son this amazing opportunity to express love without question.
Yeah, I don't know you, Roger, but that is a wonderful, wonderful observation, and a case where the questions here are far smarter than the answers could be. I really like that interpretation.
Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. So if you have one or two more questions, we'll have time. Meanwhile, I just want to mention, please mark your calendars for the Philip Roth annual lecture featuring Nicole Hannah-Jones in conversation with Jelani Cobb. That'll take place at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center on November 18th. And also mark your calendars for the weekend of March 17th through the 19th. There will be a Philip Roth Festival, which will be occurring in Newark. The schedule will be coming out in a few weeks, so we're very, very excited about that. Okay, we don't have any more questions, so I would like to thank you all for participating, in particularly Mr. Tisch for this wonderful presentation, and just hearing about the archives is really great too. Our next book club meeting will take place on Saturday, January 21st, and our host will be Steven Zipperstein, and we will be talking about Roth's first novella, Goodbye Columbus, so mark your dates for that. This presentation will be available on the Newark Public Library's Facebook page. It's been recorded and will be available there. And I hope to reconnect with all of you again in January. And if you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out at prpl@npl.org. Thank you to everybody.
Yes, thank you, everybody.